Okay, so today the presentation is on Pope Francis and four Americans. This is in honor of Pope Francis recently passed away. May he rest in peace and may perpetual light shine upon him. Um, so in 2015, Pope Francis visited um, the United States, actually visited Cuba and the United States. Um, he visited in the United States. He arrived in Washington, D.C., and then also spent a few days in New York City and a few days in Philadelphia. Um, I've been interested in Pope Francis's speech for a while, particularly because he mentions four Americans, and these Americans, I have a particular interest in all of these Americans in various ways. And so, in some ways, I found Pope Francis's mention of these four Americans to be an interesting way for me to kind of talk about who these four Americans are or to introduce these four Americans. Um, it seems like he wants to pick for Americans who are somewhat religious and spiritual models to follow. Certainly, three of these are figures that are very prominent in theology and the study of religion, major figures that many write about their spirituality, and three of them have written significantly um, contributing to the areas of Christianity, faith, theology, religion, and so forth. Um, and so two of these Americans are Catholics. And I find it interesting that he mentioned these two particular Catholics. I was speaking with some of the monks and I said, that's interesting that he mentioned these two particular Catholics because I don't think everyone knows who they are. Now, the two other non-Catholics are people that everyone does know who they are. So I think that is kind of an interesting. So in Pope Francis's speech, he does not really actually give that much biographical information about each of these. He mentions them and then goes on to a few themes. So I will provide a little bit more of the biographical information in the interest of time, probably not that much, just a few highlights, a few things that seem to me to be possibly what Pope Francis is trying to get at by mentioning these four Americans. And then in each case, Pope Francis, I will show some of what Pope Francis says in relation to these four Americans. He will mention one of these and then kind of go off on his own themes. And so here's a little bit of the kind of setup. And he's first kind of addressing the Congress themselves, the House of Representatives and the Senate, and the idea of a social responsibility and the responsibility of members of Congress, um, and to defend and preserve the dignity of fellow citizens in the tireless and demanding pursuit of the common good, for this is the chief aim of all politics. Throughout this speech, and I think throughout most of Pope Francis's uh, writings, he does a lot of mention of the common good. Okay. legislative activity, to satisfy common needs by stimulating the growth of all its members, especially those in situations of greater vulnerability or risk. That will be another theme that will come up for him. Legislative activity is based on the care for all people, and so forth. And not just giving this address to Congress, but through this address, he wants to speak to all Americans as well. He wishes to dialogue. And so dialogue will also be another theme that occurs throughout this speech. And so he would like to initiate this dialogue through the historical memory. So this again is what kind of leads him, the historical memory, recalling these four Americans. His visit takes place at a time when men and women of goodwill are marking anniversaries of several great Americans, and so forth. So, these men and women offer us a way of seeing and interpreting reality. In honoring their memory, we are inspired, even amidst conflicts, and here and now of each day, draw upon our deepest cultural reserves. And so the four Americans, Abraham Lincoln, Martin Luther King, Dorothy Day, and Thomas Merton. Dorothy Day and Thomas Merton, the two Catholics. And so I feel like, yeah, everyone knows Abraham Lincoln and Martin Luther King. And when I mentioned this to the monks in conversation when this happened, and I said, that's interesting that he mentioned Dorothy Day and Martin and Thomas Merton, as they're not everyone knows who they are. Monks said, oh yeah, everyone knows Thomas Merton and Dorothy Day. I was like, well, you're Catholic. Like most Catholics know Dorothy Day and Thomas Merton, but they're really not on the level of Abraham Lincoln and Martin Luther King. So sometimes when I'm talking about, if I want to talk about Dorothy Day, I will say, like, she's a pretty significant person. Pope Francis mentioned her when he gave this address to Congress. Or if I'm going to talk about Thomas Merton, hey, he's pretty significant. So I think that was very interesting selection of these four Americans, and so forth. So starting with Abraham Lincoln, 2015, that was the 150th anniversary of his assassination. He calls Abraham Lincoln the guardian of liberty, who labored tirelessly that this nation under God may have a new birth of freedom. He starts to talk about violence and fundamentalism, and that our response must be one of hope and healing, of peace and justice. The history of the United States, democracy is deeply rooted in the mind of the American people. Quoting from the Declaration of Independence, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So clearly, Abraham Lincoln is the president who was in office during the Civil War. And so keeping the states of the United States united. A house divided cannot stand, one of Abraham Lincoln's sayings, and so forth. I I don't really have as much to say about Abraham Lincoln. And when I talk about the three Americans Pope Francis chose to speak about, and the three that have contributed, wrote a lot in the area of theology and faith, and who have had a lot written about them. Abraham Lincoln is kind of the exception. So he is kind of you wouldn't, these four Americans, um if you think of Martin Luther King, Dorothy Day, and Thomas Merton as major figures in religion and Christian faith and so forth, um, Abraham Lincoln doesn't really fit into that. We might want to say something about Abraham Lincoln as maybe having some extraordinary virtues for a president, but nevertheless, he does seem a bit of a strange inclusion, other than the situation being that he is speaking to Congress and may have wanted to include a politician into that. I have some personal connection to Abraham Lincoln, as I consider Springfield, Illinois to be my hometown. My family moved around as I was growing up, but I ended up, my family was in Springfield for about 6 years, including my 4 years of high school. So, whereas I went to a few different grade schools in a few different states, different colleges. I did go to one high school for 4 years, so and I do have some family in Springfield. Um, this is about 13 years after my family moved away from Springfield. I went for a visit, and here is Lincoln's home in Springfield. I mean, it's a nice two-story home, and sometimes people think, oh, I thought Abraham Lincoln's home was a log cabin. Well, he grew up in poverty, but he became a lawyer and was fairly prosperous as a lawyer. So this is Lincoln's home, which is a site that people can visit today. Abraham Lincoln is also buried in Springfield, Illinois. There are some um, stories, and there is some documentation of the train from Washington, D.C. across with the body of Abraham Lincoln traveling to where he would be buried in Springfield, Illinois. And so this is his tomb. That is also a place that draws quite a few visitors, a statue of Lincoln there. Um, and so the other American Pope Francis mentions is Martin Luther King. Um, and a few of the things that he says about Martin Luther King is about the civil rights movement, the march from Selma to Montgomery. Um, Pope Francis talks about this dream, the dream that continues to inspire us all, and that America continues to be for many a land of dreams. Here, I think you can see that Pope Francis is also trying to um, nod to Martin Luther King's speech, I Have a Dream, given in Washington, D.C. in 1963. Dreams which lead to action, to participation, to commitment, dreams which awaken what is deepest and truest in the life of a people. This whole idea of the American dream. That's interesting. We have some professors here at St. Martin's who offer courses in that whole theme of the American dream. This is the dream of many immigrants to the United States, historically speaking. Millions of people came to this land to pursue their dream, building a future in freedom. The people of this continent are not fearful of foreigners because most of us were once foreigners. Um, right? Keeping in mind here that Pope Francis includes himself essentially as an American, um, not of the United States, but an American of Argentina, of South America. So that he too is a son of immigrants, knowing that so many uh, of us are descended from immigrants. Tragically, the rights of those who were here long before us were not always respected, referring to the Native American people. So here is a little bit of a reference to Native American people. He goes on, for these people and their nations from the heart of American democracy, I wish to reaffirm my highest esteem and appreciation. He goes on a little bit more in that direction. You can certainly look up the rest of the speech online to see. There's typically a lot of discussion about mentions of Native American and Indigenous people and the violent encounters and colonial legacy and so forth, and sometimes including the roles of missionaries in that process. When the Pope, any of the popes mentions indigenous people, there is some discussion. Is there an apology here for the history? I'm not really going to get into that. Oftentimes, people will say, this is great that the Pope has mentioned that. Some would also say the Pope didn't go far enough in what he should have said. I'm not really going to get into that here, but just to mention there is some mention of the Native Americans along with his references to the immigrants who came to this land. So then he speaks about refugees, a crisis of refugees globally, and the challenges of this, and that we see refugees coming into the United States. And this is, an issue in other nations as well. People who are in search of better lives for themselves and their loved ones, in search of greater opportunities. Is this not what we want for our own children? Pope Francis says that we must not be taken aback by their numbers, but rather view them as persons, seeing their faces and listening to their stories, trying to respond as best we can to their situation. And the golden rule, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Here, Pope Francis then goes on to another tangent. He's jumping around a bit thematically, but that he advocates the global abolition of the death penalty. I have been honored to teach a class on Martin Luther King a few different times in semesters in the past, and currently co-teaching with John Hopkins, our Chief Diversity Officer at St. Martin's. I feel like it's been an honor to be able to teach these classes on Martin Luther King, that I've been able to learn a lot, and it seems his message is so relevant today. And the motivation for me to offer these courses on Martin Luther King was not necessarily that he was someone that I studied in graduate school, but given the racial tensions in recent years, this is one way of starting to learn about these racial tensions and the kinds of solutions that Martin Luther King offered. And the classes that I offer on Martin Luther King, I put a lot of emphasis that this was the doctor and Reverend Martin Luther King, a Baptist minister who spoke and gave sermons to his own congregation and used biblical references in his sermons, obviously, but also in many of his public addresses as well. And who uh, was quite knowledgeable in the area of theology. Um, Here on my sabbatical last year, I was in Washington, D.C. for Martin Luther King Day. And so that was a great honor to visit the monument of Martin Luther King on the National Mall in Washington, D.C. While on sabbatical last spring semester, I was also in New York City for about 4 months, and I was staying at International House, that is in Morningside Heights neighborhood of New York City. And I was not familiar with that neighborhood before going there, and then just realized upon arrival the religious significance of the particular area that I was in, the neighborhood, but also this particular area, which is 1 block away from Union Theological Seminary, a major seminary in the United States, Protestant seminary. And there's some other significance. If I would walk down the hallway from my room, I forget, I think I was on the 8th floor. I would look out a window across a park. The trees here are a park that is about half a block. And on the other side of this park is Riverside Church. This is a church that Martin Luther King spoke at and gave his address, gave a speech condemning the Vietnam War. That was something that he had been very active in civil rights at a time when the Vietnam War was going on. And he chose ultimately not to speak out on the Vietnam War up until a point where he really felt like he could no longer maintain his silence, and started to also show the connection between war and poverty and race, and that the issues there were connected. So that was just a great experience for me to be this close to this church that I would walk by pretty much every day. Another American, and this is a little bit more about my personal experience on sabbatical. Pope Francis mentions Dorothy Day, and I'm just going to go continue on with my personal experiences of my sabbatical, which is that I wrote my dissertation on an artist, Fritz Eichenberg, who was a German American who came to the United States and got to know Dorothy Day, co-founder of the Catholic Worker Movement. And as an artist, Dorothy Day asked Fritz Eichenberg if he would contribute illustrations to her newspaper, the Catholic Worker newspaper. And so he did. And this is one of his well-known images, Christ of the Breadlines, right? So this is an image that would see and emphasize the idea of seeing Christ in all people, even the people that are most marginalized, most vulnerable, most in need, and so forth. And that is some of the key themes of the Catholic Worker Movement. One book about Fritz Eichenberg that's available is called Works of Mercy. That's a collection of essays and interviews and so forth about Fritz Eichenberg. So in spring 2024, I was a visiting scholar at Fordham University. And in that capacity, all of that on the ancestral ground of the Lenape tribe, I was able to experience more and connect with the Catholic worker community that Fritz Eichenberg also connected with. He came to the United States with his wife and daughter in 1933. And And 1933 was actually the same year that the Catholic worker movement began. Dorothy Day, who in her younger years, in her 20s, was writing for radical political newspapers, the masses, the daily masses. He was associated with communists and socialists and anarchist kinds of circles. She had a conversion to Catholicism and eventually met Peter Morin, a French man who really kind of advocated Catholic social teachings. And Dorothy really caught on to what Peter Morin was talking about with Catholic social teachings. And one of the things that she did was founded this newspaper in 1933, which sells for a penny a copy, even to this day. So you're not going to make that much money selling a newspaper for a penny a copy, but it ultimately publicizes what they're doing and draws in donations from others. So 1933, a significant year. Fritz Eichenberg and his family flee from Nazi Germany. Dorothy Day and Peter Morin found the Catholic worker movement. In 1949, then, let's say 16 years later, is when Fritz Eichenberg and Dorothy Day meet each other. One way that someone who is not familiar with the life of Dorothy Day can learn more about her is a movie called Entertaining Angels. One of the well-known actors in this movie is Martin Sheen, who plays Peter Morin. And so after converting to Catholicism and founding the Catholic worker movement, one of the things that the Catholic worker does is to establish houses of hospitality. So around the country and around the world, there are houses of hospitality. The original one in New York City, there's one up in Tacoma, and these are places, the houses of hospitality can have different kinds of missions. Many of them have like soup kitchens, providing meals for those in need. Sometimes it can be a place for shelter and so forth. While in New York, I was able to visit Manhattan University in Riverdale, which is next to the Bronx. It's kind of north of Manhattan on the other side of the Harlem River, so it's in that kind of area. Dorothy Day, Manhattan University has a Dorothy Day Center. Um, it's called, and this center is also the home of the Dorothy Day Guild, which is an organization that is promoting Dorothy Day um, for canonization as a saint in the Catholic Church. Now we can get all into the different kinds of process of becoming a saint. Um, and part of this is, you know, we don't really know, but the Catholic Church will uphold people and evaluate their lives and determine whether they are considered to have lived that life of holiness, to be models for others to follow. And there are different stages of that will, she is at, I think the stage where she is referred to as a servant of God, which I think is the first step. And then from there, you would be a blessed and then canonized as a saint. That Dorothy Day Center at Manhattan College has some artifacts from her life. This is maybe a necklace of sorts, a bracelet, more like a necklace, I guess. The image of a heart with a cross on top is kind of one of Dorothy Day's symbols. A lot of times when she wrote letters to friends, um, she would sign her name and then draw a little heart with that cross like that. Um, Here, also at the Dorothy Day Center, is a postcard with one of Fritz Eichenberg's images, the image of the peaceable kingdom. This is from the Bible, the book of Isaiah, chapter 11. It envisions the possibility of the peaceable kingdom, a place where ultimately animals, carnivores, and herbivores are living together. And even the baby, human baby, is among these different animals. Some of them we would consider dangerous animals. And that is from the book of Isaiah. This is Eichenberg's illustration of that. I also visited the Catholic Worker House in the East Village, Lower East Side. I guess it's kind of on the boundary there, um, between those two neighborhoods in New York City. And there are two houses a couple blocks from each other. Mary House, one of these houses. This is where they publish, the Catholic Worker newspaper. Here's a stack of the newspapers, and they try to do as much as they can the old-fashioned way. Hand folding, the labels will be printed, but applying each label by hand and sending them out to be mailed and so forth. And so, what is it? 5 or 6 issues a year. And then they pretty much as soon as they're finished mailing one issue, it's time to get started on the next one. Of course, the Catholic worker movement is all about the people. And so it is a place where people are living in community in a way that is kind of like a religious order. sharing their lives together, praying together, but not taking vows, not committing to the kind of religious life that is entailed with a Benedictine life. And so they are in community and they do take part in a lot of political action to protest war and create better address issues of poverty and so forth. I was very happy to visit there and to be welcomed. And they were eager to show me some of the prints of Fritz Eichenberg that they had on hand. Okay, so some of the things that Pope Francis says about Dorothy Day is just to mention uh, her social activism, her passion for justice and for the cause of the oppressed were inspired by the gospel, her faith, and the example of the saints. And that Pope Francis encourages us to keep in mind all those around us who are trapped in the cycle of poverty. They too need to be given hope. The fight against poverty and hunger must be fought constantly and on many fronts, especially in its causes. Kind of unusual that Pope Francis then goes into this tangent about business when speaking about Dorothy Day, but he is mainly referring to an encyclical that he wrote, Laudato Si, that is an encyclical is kind of like an official writing of the Pope. And he wrote this on the topic of ecology, the environment, and so forth. Referring to the earth as our common home. That is a theme that has been taken up here at St. Martin's. Sometimes you may hear about our farm. It's not ours as far as ownership, but a place where we do some farming, and we've referred to that as our common home farm was the kind of original name of that place, referring to Laudato Si. And finally, Thomas Merton. Again, I mentioned my time in New York, in the neighborhood Morningside Heights, and Thomas Merton was born in Europe and studied in England, studied at Oxford, I believe, came to the United States, and he was studying medieval literature at Columbia University. Columbia University is in Morningside Heights, and while he was studying medieval literature, he was drawn into the Catholic Church and converted to Catholicism. The church that he converted to, and apparently this is the church that he was baptized in, Corpus Christi, was about 5 minutes from where I was living. That would have been the church that I would have gone to for weekday masses, it was a joint church with another church that was about a 15-minute walk from where I was living. That is the Church of Our Lady of Lourdes. And so I would, it was a joint parish, meaning that it was kind of co-managed. They would have, they ultimately would have, I think it was the Sunday masses were at Corpus Christi, the weekday masses were at Our Lady of Lourdes. So I would go to this Our Lady of Lourdes, about a 15-minute walk from where I was, for Mass during the week. And here's an image of that. And right next to Our Lady of Lourdes is the Thomas Merton Institute for Catholic Life. This is kind of the campus ministry of Columbia University, or I should say, the Catholic Student Center of Columbia University. Columbia University does not have a religious affiliation, but some religious groups can have their own centers there. And so the Catholic Center is named after Thomas Merton, most likely because of his presence as a student of Columbia University. And I just found it interesting, even the hallway right next to between the church and where the Catholic Center is has a bit of a monastic feel to it. So what he says about Thomas Merton is that Thomas Merton, being a Cistercian, a Cistercian monk who continues to be a spiritual inspiration and guide for many people. The Cistercian order is related to the Benedictine order. We could get into the various history behind that, but ultimately, they take the rule of Saint Benedict as their foundation, similar to the Benedictines. One of the things that we can say about the Cistercians is they're referred to as strict. They have more of a strict interpretation of the rule of Saint Benedict. And so yeah, Pope Francis, when he's talking about Thomas Merton, he does mention dialogue. From the perspective of dialogue, Pope Francis wants to recognize the efforts made in recent months to help overcome historical differences. It is his duty to build bridges and to help men and women, all men and women, in any way possible to do the same. Another one of Pope Francis's famous quotations is the call to build bridges, not walls. So dialogue, building bridges, these are a major theme of Pope Francis that he sees in the life of Thomas Merton. Being in the service of dialogue and peace also means being truly determined to minimize and in the long term end the many armed conflicts throughout the world. Here, Pope Francis, you start to see, wow, he is not going easy on people with what he's saying here, condemning violence and armed conflict. Why are deadly weapons being sold to those who plan to inflict untold suffering on individuals and society? Sadly, the answer, as we all know, is simply for money. Money that is drenched in blood, often innocent blood. In the face of this shameful and culpable silence, it is our duty to confront the problem and stop the arms trade. So Thomas Merton was born in France, studied in England, came to New York City to study at Columbia University. He converted to Catholicism and then became a Cistercian monk at Gethsemane Abbey in Kentucky. He is famous for his autobiography, Seven Story Mountain. So Martin Luther King, Dorothy Day, and Thomas Merton all wrote books about faith. And in the case of all three, they were widely published. So Thomas Merton's autobiography um, sold millions. Um, so they were not really writing strictly academic books that was mainly the kinds of books that other scholars would be reading. They were writing the kinds of books that people of any kind of background were reading. Um, and so Thomas Merton was also writing against war, against racism, and so forth. Um, and ultimately, Thomas Merton became very well known for his dialogue with Asian religions, particularly Buddhism. In 1968, he wrote a book about Zen Buddhism, Zen and the Birds of Appetite, and made a trip to Asia. Um, there was an Asian journal of Thomas Merton. While he was in Asia, he met with the Dalai Lama. The Dalai Lama gave him some compliments as someone who really had a very good understanding of Buddhism. Here are some monumental Buddha statues that Thomas Merton was able to visit. There's a book called Merton and Buddhism that talks specifically about the kinds of Buddhism that Thomas Merton was interested in. Oops. Okay. Um, yeah, let me see. I'm going to pause. And so Pope Francis then uh, kind of wraps things up by kind of summarizing the themes that he sees in these four Americans: Lincoln and liberty, Martin Luther King, liberty in plurality and non-inclusion, non-exclusion, I should say. Um, Dorothy Day, social justice and the rights of persons, Thomas Merton and the capacity for dialogue and openness to God. Um, and that a nation can be considered great when it defends liberty, as Lincoln did, when it fosters a culture which enables people to dream of full rights for all their brothers and sisters, as Martin Luther King sought to do, when it strives for justice and the cause of the oppressed, as Dorothy Day did by her tireless work, the fruit of a faith which becomes dialogue and sows peace in the contemplative style of Thomas Merton. So I think that uh, hits me as really something to think about as far as the Pope's word about what makes a nation great, and uh, using his use of these four Americans to as models for that. So with that.